Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will learn about a powerful new way to create your TypeScript types and validate your data at runtime. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. Today we're learning about Zod. Now Zod in the Superman sense, General Zod, is a supervillain. But in the sense that we're learning about Zod, Zod provides TypeScript first schema validation with static type inference. So what does all of that mean? Of course, it emphasizes TypeScript, but a schema describes the structure of your data. And that's kind of also what we do with TypeScript, right? But here's the difference. TypeScript helps at the data type level during development. Your code is compiled, of course, after that, and that leaves a blind spot, right? So what about the runtime after the code is compiled? Well, sometimes you can receive unexpected data. That can come from a form with user data, it can come from an API, or even a database. But Zod lets you apply runtime type checking. So now you may be thinking, that's great, but now I have to define a schema and a type for the same data. But that's not right, because this last part here, static type inference, we can infer our types from our Zod schema, and that's very awesome. So let's check it out. Okay, I've got Visual Studio Code open, and I'm going to move a little faster today because I'm assuming you already know TypeScript and you're interested in this. And so instead of like typing along with me, we're going to just review code overall. But I do want to show you what you could install, or you could of course download my code from the repository linked in the description. So to start a project like mine, you would go ahead and open a terminal. And from there, let's go ahead and clear this out, and then I'll redo some of what I showed installed there. So we'll type npm create vite at latest to create a React project. After you get that, you'll want to go ahead and go into the project folder that you just created with vite, then type npm install to install all of the dependencies. And then finally, after that, you're going to just want to do npm I and Zod to install Zod. Now let's look at our example. Okay, notice I've got an example.ts file, and I've put it inside of a models folder because that's where I usually put my schemas when I model the data. I'm representing the data that I'm working with here. And so the first thing we're going to do is import Zod, and that's just import, and then you destructure Z from Zod. After that, I'm going to create the most basic schema that I could possibly create here just for an example. I've called it my schema, and it is just a Zod string. And this is required by default, just like in TypeScript when we create a type. Unless we say it's optional, it's required. Okay, after that, let's look at parsing this data. So we call the parse method on the schema. And here I'm parsing the string Dave, and it's going to say it's Dave, and it matches the schema. It's a string, and so we'll get Dave. But if not, if we pass in a number, for example, then it's going to throw this Zod error here. Now, there's another way to parse as well. If we look at that, this is called safe parsing, and it doesn't throw an error if the validation fails. Instead, you get an object. So here in the object, we would get success, and that would be true, and the data would be Dave. And then if it's false, of course, we'd have success false, and the error would be Zod error. So you get an object if you're using safe parse. And in an application, you may actually want to use safe parse because then you can just handle that error how you want to. Here, we would have to use a try catch and catch that error. Now, of course, there are many other things to Zod, and this is a basic example, but one I want to show here in this basic example is the use of coerce. And we chain things when we define our schema. So we have z.coerce.string. Usually, everything would come after the data type here, but coerce comes before the data type, and that's because it's coercing whatever data it receives to the data type. So if you want to make sure you're receiving a string, then you would use coerce in front of that. Then we can just use parse, of course. So now when I pass in Dave, it would be the string Dave, but also when I pass in 42, it would be a string of 42. And when I pass in a Boolean like true, it would be a string that has that value. And now I'm at the website for JSON placeholder, and I could put a link to this in the description as well, but I'm just going to create a schema based on the user data here. So the data that we would expect to receive from this API, so we can look at a more complex data type than that simple example. Okay, we're back in VS Code. We're still in the models folder, and I've created a user.ts file here for our user schemas. And we're starting with a basic user schema. You can see I've imported Zod at the top once again. And now I'm defining this basic user schema, and you can see it starts as an object, just like that data type from JSON placeholder. So we start with a z.object. Then inside this object, we start to create all of the data types. So we had a name, and now we can chain the different requirements. And you can look at the Zod documentation. There's a lot of things there, and I'm not going to cover everything today, but I think this would give you a good start. And here we're starting with, it's a string data type, and I'm also chaining a trim on here, and that's because I'm also going to use this schema in a form that we'll get to later. And so any user entered data there might have an extra space or something, and I just want to trim that. And then I'm also saying it has to have a minimum length of 2, and I'm providing a message here for validation, and this will be displayed along with that form if the user doesn't meet this minimum. So there you can put in a message for each data type. Very useful, and that's very useful when you're validating forms and want to give your users some feedback. So let's look at the next one, username. It's very similar, but notice we want the username to always be lowercase. So we're going ahead and chaining to lowercase on that as well. We've got a minimum of 4 here with the message. Now here's our email. Notice Zod has its own email validation that we can chain in there as well. So we're making sure it's a string. We're making sure it meets the requirements of an email before we trim it and set it to lowercase. Now here for the phone number, I've commented a few lines out because of what I would personally do probably for a form versus what we need to do here just to match that API data that's going to come from JSON placeholder. So to match the JSON placeholder API data, we can say it's a string, we can say it has a minimum of 10 characters or 10 digits, but after that, if I was working with a form, possibly instead of just this minimum of 10 digits, I would use a regex here and make sure it just gets numbers that are 0 through 9. I would probably make sure there was a length of 10, and then here's something very powerful. You can pass a function with this transform method that you can chain, and here I would go ahead and slice up that string that I required to be a length of 10 and only numbers, and I would put the dashes in between like I'm used to seeing here in the US. I realize other phone numbers from other places may be different, so you might want to do something different. This is what I would do, and I would slice it up and put the dashes with that appearance. So you can transform the data as well. Notice here with the website, I also commented this out, but I just wanted to show that you could do this as well, and we could apply this to a form, for example, because we wouldn't just get the string and trim it and set it to a lowercase. We would also make sure it meets the requirements of a URL as defined by Zod. And then notice we're chaining optional here. So any inputs we want to be optional, we can chain that, just like we can define optional information in a TypeScript type. Now here's what I actually did for the website, the data that we're getting from the API. So we start with a string, we go ahead and trim this and to lowercase, and the trim's more for the form again. Then we say a minimum of 5 characters. We're not using that URL type at all because some of the data from that API doesn't meet what Zod defines as a URL. However, we are using this refine method, and it's very powerful like transform. Notice I'm passing a function here, and I'm just making sure there is at least a period in there, so we could have a .com or .io or whatever. At least there's something in there and we know it's a URL. Without that, we're saying it's an invalid URL. We're still making it optional as well. And then there is a nested object here. So notice company is another object. And then inside that object, we're putting a name and a catchphrase. And if I remember right, the API actually has one more property here as well, and we're just ignoring that. And you can do that as well. So if you don't put it in your schema, Zod will not go ahead and pass it on after it's parsed. So you can filter out unneeded information that way. Here we have the name, again, string, trim, a minimum character message if it's not meant, and then a catchphrase that is optional and a string. But notice we didn't have an address in this basic user schema at all. So we're going to get to that as well. But first, let's use this basic user schema. And I'm going to use it in this library function for fetch users. So let's look at this function. I'm importing that basic user schema that we created in the user model, and I'm bringing in Zod as well. So now I expect to get user results. And those user results will be an array from that JSON placeholder API. So I'm saying it's going to be a Zod array, and I'm basing the users inside of that array off the basic user schema. Now here's the powerful part where we don't have to define types as well. We can infer using Zod.infer. So here's type user array, and then I just use z.infer and say type of user results. And now I can look at this user array type. We can see it's the user schema we defined, and it's an array type down here. So that just created our type for us. So now as I create this function, it's either a user array type or it's undefined, because we might return undefined if our response is not okay, for example. So as we get down into the function, you can see we get our JSON that is a user array type, and then we parse that data, and I'm just saying user results.parse. Notice not safe parse here, so we are catching an error if it occurs. And we're parsing that user's JSON. And of course, this is inferred because we already have the type up here. And I'm just logging this to the console so we could see the result. So if we look in our app.tsx here, you can see I'm importing fetch users, and we're calling this before the app function. So it is just called once. And we should see the data logged to the console. Notice I am importing a form here, but I've commented it out for now, which is why we see the gold or yellow highlight here, because TypeScript is saying we're not using the form yet, but we'll get to that. Let's go ahead and start this project now. So we open up a terminal, and after that we can just type npm run dev to start the Vite project, and we'll go ahead and click on localhost 5174. I've pulled up the browser. Let's open the dev tool so we can see the console. And we see in the console we have an array of 10 users. So let's look at this user data. And we can see we get the company that's even a nested object, email, name, phone, username, and website, but we don't get some of that other data that was in the data that is received actually from the API, like the user ID or the address, things like that. So we kind of discarded that when we didn't put those inside of our schema. So let's look at how we can optionally add some more of that to our schema. I'm back in VS Code in the user model file. So let's scroll down underneath the schema we created. And now let's look at creating an address schema that is separate, because that address data from JSON placeholder is also a nested object. So we create that with an object, and it has a street, suite, city, and zip code. But there was one other piece that was added to the address as well, and that was geo coordinates. So we've got latitude and longitude here, its own object. So it's a nested object within the address object that is within the larger user object. So we have to work with both of those. Let's look at how all of this works. So here we define our user address schema much like we did our basic user schema above. You can see I'm applying a regex here as well to part of the zip code for the address. And other than that, it isn't anything that we didn't really cover before. Let's look at the user address schema with geo down here. Notice we're extending the user address schema. So we're going ahead and extending what we just defined above, and then we're adding this geo part to it. Now here you would expect this latitude and longitude to possibly be numbers, but if we look at the data from JSON placeholder, it's also string data. So that's what's expected, and if it doesn't match, remember, it won't validate. So that's what we have set this to as well. And then notice underneath this, I've also defined a hasID schema. And this is an object that has an ID that is a number because it is a number inside of that API data. We're making sure it is a integer as well and not a decimal or anything like that. And we're also making sure it is a positive number. Then let's look at what we can do with this information. So here we're defining a user schema with address. So we're taking the basic user schema And then we're extending that schema and we're adding the address property to it. And we're just applying this user address schema. Remember, it doesn't have the geo coordinates. And then we're going ahead and chaining at the end of that, and we're merging that schema that is extended with the has ID schema. So that will also be added. So I wanted to show both ways you can do that. We could extend and add this ID property this way, the way we defined it, or we could define it up here and then we can just merge with it. So we're just chaining that together. Likewise with the user schema with geodata, we're using that basic user schema. We're extending the address, but now for the address, we're using that user address schema with geo. And then we're once again merging in that ID. So then we've essentially created two different ones here. We've got a user schema with the address, or we've got a user schema with the geo coordinates as well. And once those are defined, then we can infer the types from those schemas that we've created with Zod. So we have a user with address type or a user with geo coordinates type. Okay, now let's take these schemas and types and go back to our fetch users where we can use the new ones. So instead of basic user schema, we'll have I believe it was user schema with address. There we go. And I'm going to copy that down and put it here where we create our user results array as well. And now we're going ahead and creating that array for user results. It's the same, and we're inferring the type of here is the same as well. So we should be good with this user schema with address for our first example. Now let's go back to the browser and see what we get inside of the console here for the latest results. So here's the latest results. And now let's see if this has an address added. And yes, it does. So besides the nested company object, now we have a nested address object. And you can see inside of the address, we have city, street, suite, and zip code. We do not have the geo coordinates because we didn't add that. So let's go ahead and do that next with the other type and schema that we created. So once again, inside of the fetch users, let's say user schema with geo, and I'll just select both with Control D, arrow to the end, back up over here, say with geo, there we go. Save that, and so now we've got user schema with geo. So now with these changes, let's once again go back and look at the latest data in our console. We scroll up, we have another 10 users here, and now let's look at the address, and the address data should have this nested geo data inside it as well. So we've once again validated the data according to the schema and applied Zod, and we did not get any errors. Notice this data is a string type that matches our schema. But we did not coerce any of this data. We made sure we were defining our schema according to the data the API told us we would receive. Before we move on to the form, I just wanted to come back to the user schema for a little bit, because if this looks complicated to you, of course, dive into that documentation. You just want to learn what all of these things do. And this is basically just working with objects here. So you're extending an object by adding a new property to it, or you can merge another object with a previous object like we did here with the hasID schema. So there are both of those options and many more options available in Zod. So you can see what all you can require and apply to these different data types, just like I chained these different things here for each data type as well. Okay, let's move on to working with the form and applying that Zod validation. So I've got the terminal open. I'm going to stop our application for now. We're going to need to install React Hook Forms and a resolver. So this is what you'll want, npm-i and then react-hook-form. Then you want a space, and you also want @hookform/resolvers. And let's remove that ending part because you do not need that. You just need @hookform/resolvers. You go ahead and enter that. I've already got mine installed, but let that install, add that to your dependencies. I'm also using Tailwind in this project, and if you download my code and install, you'll have it. If not, you can of course install Tailwind, as you might already know how to do, into your React project. A quick look at what we're using. We're using React Hook Form, which is a very popular library for React forms. This is react-hook-form.com. And if you go to the Get Started page, you see some examples, and they do provide TypeScript examples. That's very good, but we're not going to use just the basic example here. I wanted to go to the TypeScript page, and right now the TypeScript page is not loading well, and I haven't been able to get it. So what I did is I put this URL in Google, or the URL for the TypeScript page, which is just /ts at the end. I Googled it, and then I pulled up the cached version. So the last copy they have was about a week or so ago, May 17th. And then we get the TypeScript support page. Now I'm going to use code that comes from this submit handler example, and then I merged some of this code with the code I found at the hook form /resolvers dependency here for React hook form, because this is where it supports Zod, and they have different examples. So I went to the Zod example and applied much of what I saw here, where we're going to use the zodResolver as well. So I'll put both of these links in the description, but I wanted to show you this ahead of time. We're also going to use the useForm hook that is available from React hook forms, and we'll apply this trigger here, which is one of the many things that you see over here on the left that are available from the useForm hook with React hook forms. We're back in VS Code, and I have my form component pulled up. I'm going to review this code with you instead of typing it out because it would take me much longer, and I think you could slow this down or repeat anything you need, and I've provided the code as well. So what we get from React hook form when we import here is the submit handler and the useForm hook. And then from the hook form resolvers /Zod is where we import this from. We import the zodResolver. After that, I'm importing the user schema with address that we previously created in our user model. And then I've also imported the type now, user with address. And we're going to apply all of this to the form. So now when we start to define the form component, we're going to get several things from useForm hook, and we need to say, hey, this is a type user with address right here when we pull in the useForm hook. So we're going to pull in register, handle submit, trigger, and then a form state, and we can destructure errors from that form state. Now inside of this useForm hook we have a resolver, and this is where we use the zodResolver, and we pass the schema that we've created, so the user schema with address that we imported from our user model. Now if we scroll down, we can create an onSubmit function here that is called when we submit the form, and it's the type here submit handler, and this is where we pass the type user with address as well. Now here, I'm just logging data to the console. So we're just making sure we get that data. You could do whatever you wanted here with the form. You would probably send it somewhere else, store it in a database, whatever you would do at that point. But just know that it is being validated before you get it here. So we would have validated data to handle right here inside of the onSubmit function. So let's look at the basic form before we pull it up in the browser. And it starts with a fragment. And that's because I have a button and then the form, and this button uses the trigger function. So I'm just calling it here in the click handler, and this trigger is going to display the data requirements. So you're essentially triggering the form like you submitted it, and then of course none of those requirements are met, so it's going to display the data requirements underneath. Now if you have more than one requirement as defined in your user schema, it's going to give you one error at a time, and as you fulfill one of those, maybe the next requirement isn't fulfilled yet, so it will display the error message for that if you have more than one. And we can see how that works as we fill out the form. So here's our form, and the onSubmit click, or the onSubmit handler I should say, receives this handle submit, and then we just pass onSubmit to it. Now handle submit is just part of what I saw in the example code before we had here. So we have this handle submit pulled in here. It's nothing we defined. It's just something that we get from that useForm hook. And then we pass our onSubmit function that is the submit handler right here. After that, everything's going to be very much the same for every input for the most part. So we start off with a label, of course, that's linked to the input, and then we can display errors if they exist. Now there's a couple of things to note here. React hook form has us using register, which we also pulled in from useForm up here. Here's register. So notice here, we're spreading register here and then putting in the name that we have for the input. So we need to do that for each one of these. And then if there is an error, we can display the error. So if an error exists here, which is what we're checking before the double ampersand, then I have a paragraph that will have red text and a yellow background, and it will display the error.name and message if it exists. So notice we're just using optional chaining on the message. And this applies to pretty much every field as we go down, and it's a fairly long form because I wanted to have several examples, and we're basically matching up all of that user data for the most part. So you can see all of this code in the examples here, and we even get down to company name, company slogan, and catchphrase. All of these things are right here. So now let's go ahead and look at the form and see how it works. And for me to show the form, I'm going to need to go to the app component that we have over here and go ahead and remove this comment so the form will actually display. We were already importing it, but I had it commented out. So now that we have that, let's open up a terminal once again and type npm run dev. If you remember, I had previously stopped the dev environment from running because we installed everything else we needed for React Hook Forms as well. Let's go ahead and click localhost 5174 and we'll look at our form in the browser. So here is the form, and I've got this display data requirements button over here, and then after that I've got the form centered and looking a little bit better. But I wanted to add this button with the trigger function just to show what it could do. But let's fill out the form before we would just display the data requirements. So I'll start typing my name, go ahead and say Dave just twice, but notice we're not getting really any messages for validation, and so we're not sure if what we're putting in is good or not. So if we display the data requirements, or if we go ahead and submit down here and we're not meeting any of those requirements, we're going to get all of those validation messages. It looks like it's okay with the username, but what if we had something like, yeah, here it says username must be 4 or more characters long now that I deleted it. And we could just put in Dave like that, and then it goes away once again. So here, this is an invalid email. We have to match all of that up. So we would say email@email.com. It looks like it's good with that. 555 street. We don't have to have a suite. That was optional. Here's Kansas City. That would work just fine. We have 555. 55, optional 4-digit extension, notice, so we don't have to have the 4-digit extension, but if we do, or we start to add it, we need to go ahead and complete it. And then for a phone number, here I've got the hyphens in the placeholder, and I probably shouldn't, but it would go ahead and allow it because I didn't put in my preferred regex, I put in what would match that API data. So here we could have just about anything, I think. Say 123-1234. Yep, that's just fine. And URLs must be at least 5 characters. So if we said my website, after that, now it says invalid URL because we met the first requirement, which was the minimum of 5 characters, but we didn't meet the URL requirement yet. And remember that at least had to have a dot that we used in that refine function there. And we could put in a company name, and Acme Co. seems like it's just fine. Company slogan is optional, so we don't have to have that either. So by doing all of that, we could actually see that we fulfilled everything that was needed. So if I refresh here, then we clear all of that out essentially by refreshing. We could have put a reset button here as well, but we just cleared all of that out. Now if I just want to display the data requirements, that calls that trigger function, and it does the same thing. And then notice if we try to submit, it's really not going to submit. We'll go ahead and open up our terminal over here. We have our array of 10 users that we were getting from our fetch users, but it's not submitting the data. When we do submit it, it will log to the console because it is not validating. So now we can go ahead and say, Dave, and I can fill all this out again quickly, hopefully, at email.com, 555 street. AC is good. We'll say zip code 55555, phone number 123-123-1234, website, yourwebsite.com. And Acme. Oh, seems good. Let's submit. And we're not getting anything in the console like expected, and I think I know why. We're going to need to go back to VS Code, so I'm going to pull that back up. Let's go ahead and close out of the terminal window. And what we want to do here with form state is pull in something else from the use form, and that is valid. And then from there, we could just log that somewhere here in our component just to see if we are providing valid information to the form that matches our schema, for example. So now we can pull the browser back up. Of course, we resaved everything, but we instantly have false, so we know that's working. So Before I fill out the form once again, let's go ahead and go back to the code because I know the problem, and the problem is back here in the user that we defined in the model. That's because we're not providing an ID, but right now we're trying to use the schema that does have an ID with it. So we have the user schema with address right here. Notice we're merging the has ID schema onto that. And if we go to the form, we're using that user schema with address. So let's go back here to user, find user schema with address, and let's not merge that ID in for this example. So I'll just comment that out. And now we should be able to fill out our form and it would be valid. So let's go ahead and check that out as well. And you could display that valid if you wanted to, but it wouldn't make much sense to the user. This is something you definitely want to catch during development, that your data schema matches the form that you're creating. So now let's fill this out again and let's see what we get over here in the console after we fill it out. So I'll do this as quickly as possible. Dave, email.com, 555, street, KC, 55555, and 123, website.com, Acme Co. And now it says it's valid before we even submitted. So the form is telling us, hey, yes, it's valid. So that's a great thing to check during development. Let's go ahead and submit. Now we get everything here inside that we were logging in that onSubmit function. We were logging the name individually, and then we were logging this information here. We got the is valid from the form a couple of times as well. But this is what we really wanted to ensure that we got after we submitted the form, because then we could work with this data, send it to somewhere else, or anything like that. So just a good example right there of something I didn't check before. I forgot to remove that ID when I was working with the form. So I would want to actually probably create another schema that didn't have that ID, and then one with the ID to use with the API, for example. So overall, Zod is really helping validate that data and the types. We're inferring the types from that Zod schema, so everything is matching up from development right into runtime, and I really like working with Zod, and I think I will continue to use it in future projects. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.